Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Stevenson. I'm the Executive Vice President and COO at Thermo Fisher, and pleasure to be with you all virtually this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are in the world. My talk today will deal with the topic of lessons learned from scaling. And for those not familiar with the term Blitzscaling, it's the title of a best-selling book by Reid Hoffman, one of the founders of LinkedIn and other companies, and Chris Ye. And for those not read the book, it's really about how do you scale startups? How do you drive and manage for extreme growth that really prioritizes speed over efficiency and in an environment of uncertainty? One of the principles of the book is that actually you should choose software businesses over hardware businesses. Specifically talks about why it's easier to do that, since it's easier to scale bytes rather than atoms. And at Thermo Fisher, in the status of the pandemic response last year, we were faced with how do we scale our societal response for COVID-19. And so today's talk compares what at Thermo Fisher we talk about speed at scale with experiences from the past year, some lessons learned as I reflect on those, and what is the thoughts going forward in what we can expect and how large companies like Thermo Fisher or small companies can think about scaling businesses, whether being in a pandemic or other situations. Before I get started, let me ground you with a couple of facts about Thermo Fisher. Thermo Fisher is the world leader in serving science. By scale, we're about $32 billion in revenue last year. About $6 billion of that was related to our response for COVID-19. And in my role as EVP and COO, I oversee the life sciences, our diagnostic and analytical instruments, as well as our innovation for the company and our digital strategy. I've been with the company more than 20 years, and I started originally at Applied Biosystems, which became part of Life Technologies and then Thermo Fisher. And so therefore my background very much in the genetic side, starting when we were sequencing originally the human genome and progressing on through the use of genetic analysis in various applications. In terms of the breadth and depth of the company, this is one of the key advantages, and I'll talk about in our pandemic response. We're a broad company of solutions for our customers, pharmaceutical, biotech, academic, government customers that span from our life science solutions into specialty diagnostics, analytical instruments that were used early on in some of the pandemic response and continue to be used, and then laboratory and pharma services that are part of the response as well. I'll go into more detail on those and share some examples as I go through my presentation today. So our COVID-19 response, which started really just over a year ago now when we first saw our customers in China responding to this, really came to the fore about exactly a year ago in March 13th when we received first approval from the FDA for our diagnostic kit. And I'll go into this in more detail. At the same time, many pharmaceutical and biotech customers started their development of their therapies and vaccines. And at this time last year, we counted more than 250 programs and projects that we were supporting, that were in development, and continue to be today. And obviously some now have come through approval to commercialization. And finally, for many of our customers, the challenge was keeping open their operations. And so that was also part of supplying personal protective equipment, cleaning, and other essential supplies to the laboratories of a lot of our key customers. So in terms of blitzscaling, what it took during this last year, I'm going to use 3 case studies to illustrate some of the points. In the first case study, I'll talk about scaling manufacturing. As I just mentioned, we received our first approval for our diagnostic assay, the TACPath assay, on March 13th of last year. And at that point, there was a dramatic need to scale. As we look at that first example, we were actually faced at that time with, we were making about a couple of thousand kits per week. And we set a goal at that time to increase that capacity to 5 million kits a week. Actually, a very public goal before we'd actually thought about how we would do that, exactly what it was capable, and continued to take that goal up in factors of doubling. So as we approached the 5 million, we doubled to 10 million. We're currently shipping in that order and have the capacity to double again to 20 million. So we committed to scaling, and this approach to blitzscaling actually was one of the first principles we took, was set a very aggressive goal and then find creative solutions how to scale. A couple of examples I'll give you in that. Firstly, the supply chain. These kits have more than 60 components in it with many various suppliers, and often found sole sourced or needed to scale our supply chain. So took very aggressive action to work with those suppliers, with partners, to scale up that supply chain. Equally, our manufacturing is a very global nature. Many of the instruments that we need to provide in this workflow, our PCR instruments, are made in Singapore and close to the border with Malaysia. And at that time, actually, the borders were getting closed down. So we had to house some of our Malaysian workers actually in the Singapore hotels, and then work with the Singapore and Malaysian government to open travel pathways between the two countries to enable us to continue to work. A second example as we progressed in the pandemic was actually what we found was there were extreme shortages of certain components, one of which was the viral transport media that was used to transport the virus and the samples from swabbing into the laboratories. The US government recognized that and issued a requirement to supply 170 million transport media or vials on this. For us, this was a product we'd been making for 30 years, but to actually progress required us to build a whole new factory. The product we had been approved, as I say, for decades, but at that point, we'd not made it at this kind of scale. So we needed to rethink what was possible in building a factory. We set a goal to build this factory in 6 weeks. As you see this video playing in the background, you can see what it takes to actually build a factory. I think one of the keys in this case was engaging with the local state. In this case, this was built in Lenexa in Kansas. And by engaging with the local state, we actually progressed very quickly through what would have been, I think in many projects, slow of government approvals, recruiting workers, and really mobilized an effort on a local level with large recruitment fairs, with large approvals of everything from electrical suppliers to construction in order to get this completed in time. We've installed in this site automated facilities, automated processing, and now producing about in excess of 10 million tubes per week coming out of this site, and have actually replicated this site now in the UK for a similar project for the UK government. Moving on to the next slide. Actually, let me take one back. One final example I would like to give you is an example of a partnership together that we did with Oxford University. In that case, we were actually approached by Oxford University. Many of you sort of might be familiar with the Oxford story, in that they were one of the first to identify and work with viral vectors that later became a therapy and a treatment with AstraZeneca. And in that case, what we found was very critical to actually enable this kind of partnership. We worked together with Ocer to produce a serology assay, designed and validated the assay for them, and have now rolled it out. That's been used to look at the immune response and test the effectiveness of vaccines. So as we look beyond some of these case studies, let me talk about sort of key lessons learned from Blitzscaling, how we're thinking about next steps. Firstly, we think about people. Let me read you an example from the Blitzscaling book that particularly struck with me. When you think about the mindset of the people involved in Blitzscaling and startups, skill sets are often described in comparison to the Marines, the Army, and the police. You're adding qualitatively different types of people to the team, where the Marines are really taking the beach, the Army are the soldiers who know how to come on and scale up, and then rapidly seize and secure territory. And then the forces that come behind are the police that produce army and governance. And as you blitzscale, you often need different types of people. And I think as we thought about it from scaling up our operations and what does it look like for people and governance, that actually played out as we scaled out with the different types of people within the company. It even played out with our customers. As you think about an example I'll give you in the UK, where we helped scale up what was processes in academic labs using PCR in universities. Those we can analogize to early Marines. Actually, the British Army was involved in helping us set up lighthouse labs that moved equipment actually out of the universities into large lighthouse labs during last April, May to set up large processes. And then as testings became more routine, it became different people to actually run in a National Health Service, in routine hospitals, and achieve point of care systems in a more routine setting. The second type of learning we thought about was leadership lessons. 5 lessons are referred to in this. We thought about one was purpose-driven. Very much as a company, we're purpose-driven, but in this case, aligning people around the goal and the mission. A bias towards action and moving quickly in a period of great uncertainty, not knowing how long the pandemic would last and how long it would go. A trust, a resilience with that trust, but emphasizing both existing team relationships and trust in action. And finally, empathy for the team, managing when you're running a team, what some people referred to as a marathon in sprints, required also breaks, since this was complete 24/7 working. At a very intense time during this year, I was reminded recently by one of our pharmaceutical customers who gave the quote many of you may know from Teddy Roosevelt, the man in the arena quote, "It's really not the critic who counts, it's the man who has the strong man who stumbles. It's where the doer of deeds could have done better." And as we thought about critics on time frame, on supply, we certainly felt that we were in that arena. The final point I'd make is on processes. So we found that many of our existing processes just didn't scale to this kind of approach. We started by aligning on priorities, the bold goals that we set, and then looked at decisions and what were the constraints, the high nails in that approach to knock those down to deal with that. We also took an approach to management, which was taking a monthly approach, breaking down into weekly, with really big goals, we call them big rocks, that we use to communicate outcomes to the team for each of those weeks. So what's next as we look forward? As we think about next stage, really 2 great sort of themes we think about. One is things that continue as part of the action of the pandemic continuing, even moving to the endemic stage. And the second being around what are the trends that have been accelerated in this time that we think will need to continue as we go on. We turn first to the first example, which is looking at what's next in the pandemic. Of many of this group, I'm sure, are aware as we think about the pandemic continuing and outbreaks still occurring in many countries. We do think that it will move from symptomatic testing the people we know are sick through temperature, to what we now know about the virus, with more than 50% of cases being asymptomatic spread. So surveillance being incredibly important in this, setting up surveillance programs both to detect the virus and allow return to back to life normal, back to school, back to work, back to travel, but also detecting spread of new viruses, be those new mutations we can detect, or actually finding those new viruses. And this will be part of the next step. The second part, I think, as we move into the endemic, and many have compared this to what do we do in the annual flu season, is looking at other upper respiratory diseases I think will be necessary to diagnose. And that we think will continue as we go on into the autumn and fall period here, as well as enabling more research around long COVID immune response. Why is such a different host response to this virus? And what is it we still need to learn about in this case? The second major area we think about is what are the major trends that have been accelerated by COVID-19? A couple that we'll think about here is certainly the evolution of diagnostic testing. I think widely being accepted now that it's hard to diagnose a disease if actually you don't have good diagnostics. In this case, it turned out with viruses, hard to diagnose just with host response of symptoms. We also saw diagnostic testing moving and continuing to move closer to the patient, not only to in-pharmacy actions, but also to point of care testing. And I'll talk about evaluations we've done on new technologies and how we've thought about that. The second is acceleration of new modalities. I think over the last year, we've seen good acceleration in the pharmaceutical industry and biotech of biologics, of gene-based therapies, cell-based therapies, which accelerated some investments for us in areas like viral vector manufacturing to support such therapies. But now this new class as well of mRNAs come through large vaccine trials, obviously with the Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna vaccines coming through, accelerated the need for supplies around that and innovation around that mRNA workflow. One example I thought I'd share with you as we think about new technologies is how we go about evaluation. One of the accelerations that I think occurred in the diagnostic framework was just the innovation around rapid point of care. We certainly have evaluated more than 50 different technologies in this area. As an initial investment, we decided to acquire and announce the acquisition of Mesa Biotech, a San Diego-based company. And in some of the characteristics we were looking for as we evaluated rapid diagnostics, we wanted something that here was listed with a simple cartridge-based PCR, where the expertise was in the cartridge and therefore very affordable, that had a high sensitivity and a very rapid turnaround time, that we could support different sample types, be that from nasal, throat, deep nasal pharyngeal, ability to look beyond COVID and at multiplexing assays. And then very importantly, as we've looked at, and sort of one of the other lessons from blitzscaling is many technologies are available, but can they be scaled to be relevant? And so the ability on a timeline to scale very rapidly requires a design in the technology that allows us to scale. So I hope some of my comments have been helpful to you today and how Thermo Fisher's lessons from the last year. Certainly, it's often said that large companies, it's harder to scale. And certainly, as the book outlines, harder to scale atoms rather than bytes. But hopefully, I've shown in some of the case studies that it is possible to use both some of the principles and some of the practices of changes in how you approach leadership and enabling groups to scale and scale at large scale. Second point is collaborations, both collaborations in technology and early sharing, collaborations with industry, collaborations with government and academia, I think have been incredibly important during this last year and hopefully continue at that rate. And hopefully this conference is part of those collaborations to continue to progress interesting innovations that can be meaningful, not only now in the pandemic, but going forward to move science forward. And thirdly, I think the pandemic has accelerated trends that were ongoing in digital health and new modalities. But I think as we reflect on sort of what's next, we certainly see some of those will continue and are looking at how do we continue to react with speed at scale to these latest trends as we continue to support our customers through the life sciences areas. With that, I'll thank you for your attention today and hope you have a great conference.